Hey everybody, this is Scott. It's been a little while since I did a video, so I thought I would kind of do one real quick on a somewhat interesting subject. It's a little different than my other tutorials, which are more of walkthroughs. This is kind of taking the assumption that you've already built an Ember app or you're already pretty familiar with Ember, but you want to maybe improve your app and you want to do something that a lot of people complain about, which is remove jQuery entirely from your Ember application. So it is entirely possible. I'm going to kind of go through that step by step and how we can hopefully remove jQuery from the equation and hopefully reduce your app size as well. And we're going to do that with the Super Rentals repo. So if you've watched any of my tutorials before, you know I use this one a lot. This is the app that you would build if you were to follow the Ember Guides website, and it has some simple examples of using jQuery within an app, and we can kind of walk through how we can stub that out. So let's actually just start fresh. I am going to simply copy this to my folder here, so git clone, and we'll pull that down, and we'll go into that directory, and let's do our npm install and bower install. So once you've done npm install and bower install, let's go ahead and start that app just so we can take a quick look at it here. Cool, so this is our app running here. It's a pretty simple app if you haven't seen it. It just lists some rentals that you can rent. You can sort them or search for them by name. We'll update that list dynamically. You can also click on one for more detail. So really simple app. So what we want to do again is remove Ajax from the equation. And Ember ships by default with Ajax kind of in three major places. So let me bring this full screen. And the first place that it is that we're going to tackle is within Ajax requests. So that's something that Ember data ships with. It uses jQuery for its Ajax requests as well as Ember Ajax. So if we look at our package JSON, we have Ember Ajax here. We're actually going to get rid of that entirely, and Ember data, obviously, which this app uses. So how do we get around that? So there's already an add-on that's going to help us with that. It's called ember-cli fetch. It uses GitHub's fetch library to make Ajax requests for us, and it's a pretty simple kind of plug and play for the most part. The only thing that we're going to have to do for this specific app is add the adapter fetch mixin to our application adapter. So any adapters that you would have within your application, you're going to want to add this mixin to. And what this really does is just overwrites Ember Data's Ajax request hook to not use jQuery anymore. Secondly, if you're writing any Ajax requests manually, so you're not using the Ember Data store to request data, but you're instead writing your own Ajax request, probably with Ember Ajax, you would then rather use the fetch method. And it works almost exactly the same as the Ajax request in terms of syntax. Is you just use fetch instead, so you're going to import fetch from fetch. So this app doesn't have an example of that, but just keep that in mind. And if you want more examples, just check out the library. They have some documentation that you can look at there. So we are going to install this, Ember install, Ember fetch. Cool, so let's actually kill our app and restart it because it has some initializers that it needs to run. And again, all we're going to do is copy this one line and add this to our application adapter. So let's find our application adapter. Oops. We'll add that here, and we'll add that mixin. If you don't know what mixins are, I actually have a tutorial video on what mixins do for us. But basically, it's just adding a bunch of pre-made functions to this class for us. So this is all we have to do to remove jQuery from the Ajax equation within this repo. And again, you probably are going to have other places of multiple adapters. It's the only adapter we have within Super Rentals, so it's pretty easy to do that. And now we are Ajax or jQuery free in terms of Ajax requests. So let's refresh this app and then just make sure it still loads. And let's also run our tests and just make sure everything still passes. Cool. So now that we're looking at tests, this brings us to the second place that Ember kind of ships with jQuery by default, and it's probably the most obvious place, and that's within integration tests and acceptance tests. And in fact, integration tests by default have you writing jQuery, and if you follow the tutorials on the Ember Guides website, you'll see that specifically you're writing jQuery. So let's look at an integration test. So here we go, is a somewhat simple test. So this is that searching filter that I showed you. The test that they have you write, essentially you just make sure that all the cities appear, and then in this test we ensure that if we search for something and trigger the search event, that it will filter the list down appropriately for us. So how can we remove jQuery from this entirely? And once again, we're going to use a pre-made library for us called Ember native DOM helpers. So let's pull this up. This is written by a coworker of mine, Cybernox, and all this information that I got, I should say, for this tutorial, I pretty much got from watching him. He's kind of going through the Ember community, ripping jQuery out in a lot of different places. So certainly a hat tip to him and everything that I've kind of learned through watching him. So in this app, we're not going to be using an updated version of Babel, so we're not going to do async and await. But as you can see, we get a couple helpers to work around, the default jQuery hooks. So find all, key event, trigger event. That's what we're going to use within these tests instead of the regular jQuery selectors. So let's go back and install this add-on, Ember install Ember native DOM helpers. And again, let's restart our app here. And our tests are running fine. So let's go through and update this test. So one of the helpers we're going to want to bring in is the find helper. And we're going to import that directly from that library. So we're going to import find from Ember native DOM helpers. And we're going to use that to replace this function here. So find city. We don't have to use the first because the find method by default is going to find the first one for us. If we want to find multiple, that's when we use the find all method. So in this one right here, we will use find all because we're finding multiple and we're making sure that we have 3 of them. And text, that's a jQuery function. We're instead going to search for the text content and make sure that that works. So let's save that and make sure all our tests pass, and they do. So that's a pretty simple fix there. So we've already removed jQuery from one of our tests, so now we need to remove it from this one. So if you have questions on how this works, I recommend going to the Ember Guides website. I'll kind of walk you through what exactly this test is doing. Again, we're just going to focus mainly on the jQuery components here. So here what we do is we find this input, we fill in some value, and it triggers a key up event. So in order to do that, we need to import a couple more things from Ember native DOM helpers. We need to grab fill in, so that will fill in an input for us, as well as trigger event, which is similar to the jQuery's like .trigger key up, which is essentially what we're doing here. So we are going to fill in that input, this filter input, and the second argument to this function is what we're going to fill it in with. So we're going to fill in this input with this value. Then we need to trigger that key up event. So trigger event, list filter input, and similarly accepts 2 arguments, which is the key up event. So what event are we triggering? And now we can delete this line. And then just like we did above, we can replace this with find all, and we can replace this with find. This needs to be text content instead of text, which is the jQuery shorthand, and all of our tests still pass. We're doing the same exact thing that we were doing before, but we're doing it without jQuery in that specific test. So this application only has 3 integration tests, so let's go through and see if we can remove jQuery from these other ones as well. So similarly, we are going to import find all in this test from Ember native DOM helpers. And this is the only assertion here that actually uses jQuery. So .children is a jQuery method, convenience method. So we do have to kind of write this a little bit longhand. And that is what you'll find when you start replacing a lot of these jQuery hooks. Yeah, jQuery does allow you to really write things shorthand. That was kind of the idea behind it in a lot of ways. In here you're going to use, native DOM helpers. And I should note, if you read through the documentation, native DOM helpers do a lot more than just get around jQuery. They're better at triggering events. They trigger events the way that a user would actually trigger events. Whereas with jQuery, events are often triggered twice. And if you want more kind of details on that, Cybernox goes into a lot more detail in the documentation there. But it can be a bit more verbose. So keep that in mind, certainly, when you're importing these libraries. So how do we get around finding the children here? We can ideally just grab whatever the first child element is, but I don't really know that off the top of my head. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the test, but I'm going to pause them. And we're going to use the assert async method. This is a way to pause integration tests. You can literally see the test itself in the doc within the test runner. You'll see it'll go through and it'll pause right here. Now this test is somewhat blank because it's stubbing everything, but this is essentially our application, right? So if I come and just inspect here, I should be able to find that map container div, which is here. And it looks like the only child that it has is one div. So when it's searching for children, it's searching for the number of divs within that element. So I think we can kind of write around that rather than writing children. Here, let's copy this line. We're going to do find all. And we're going to find divs that are children of map container. And we can delete this method here. We can delete this. And let's delete our assert async and run all tests again. And we all pass. So assert async, really, really helpful way within QUnit if you ever want to pause integration tests and just kind of take a look at what's happening. Super, super handy. So finally, we have our rental listing test. And this test has a couple of jQuery events, specifically click events. And it looks like we are using what would be the find all, when we're testing for length. So let's import those. Import. We're going to import the click helper as well as the find all helper from Ember native DOM helpers. So here, actually let's kind of grab all of these at once and replace these with find all. And then here with these two lines, rather than finding the element calling .click, we will use the click method, which we can just pass in the selector like that. Cool. So let's see if our tests pass still. And they do. So again, we've written all of our integration tests now without using jQuery whatsoever. And again, when you generate a component, the blueprint does ship it with jQuery, even if you have this add-on installed. So just keep that in mind, that it might try to force you to write jQuery, but you certainly don't have to. So that takes care of jQuery within our tests. So let's actually search for $ within tests, and we can see we actually don't have any. So that's cool. Before we did. Now the only other place within this app, though, is there is jQuery used here. So this $ is a template string. We're going to ignore that. So the maps component, the thing that actually loads the maps into the component itself, uses jQuery and a jQuery selector here. So what we can do to get around that is just use a native DOM selector. So rather than this $$, one thing you can do within components is you can get this this .get element. So element actually refers to the DOM element of this component. If you watch my video on components, you know that you can update what DOM element it is by specifying the tag name. By default, it's just going to be a div. That's what we saw in our test when we inspected it. It was a div with the class of map container. So we're just going to grab this element, referring to this component, and then we're going to grab, we're going to use the query selector method, which is just a native DOM document selector. That is, literally just document.query selector. If you have a somewhat updated version of Babel, you should have this within your app map container, and then we'll just copy this here. So we should be able to do the same exact thing that we were doing before, and all of our tests pass, and our maps are still there. So that's what that component is, showing us the map. So again, same exact thing, except we're doing it without jQuery. So the next place within our test that we want to update is our acceptance test. Now you might think, this isn't using jQuery. I don't see the symbol anywhere, but it is kind of behind the hood, so to speak, and we can still use that same add-on. So we're still going to use Ember native DOM selectors here. So let's import that. Import, and we're going to go over what we want to import from there. So the first one that we want to use is visit. So we're actually overriding the default visit method that visits URLs within our app. And you can see again our tests still pass, but they're doing it in a way that doesn't use jQuery anymore. So looking over these these tests, you can see, all right, we have a click event, and that's fine. We can just import the click event. Fill in, which we're doing the same thing. Key event as well. And then it looks like we are using find, and this should be a find all. So let's import those. So we're going to import click, find all, and key event. And the only thing we should have to update are these find all and find all. And if we save that, our tests should still pass, but they don't. So our tests are failing because our tests use a jQuery selector of contains. So that is not available to us with native DOM selectors. So we kind of have to find a different way that we're going to update these acceptance tests. So similarly to in the integration test, how I paused it, the way I would solve this is to pause this acceptance test and just see if I can find another way to select this element. And you can do that by doing what's called the pause test method. So if we return pause test, it will actually rerun these tests, but it will pause this acceptance test where I tell it to. And now I can, just like any other website, I can inspect it and look through this to kind of see, one, does everything show up the way that I would expect it to, and two, to kind of see how the app's rendering itself. So it looks like everything's wrapped in this jumbo div, so I could probably just grab that selector and then refer to the a tag within it. Most likely help. So that should get me around that. Normally I would use a library called data test selectors. We use this at Dockyard in literally every single repo. It allows you to add tags to elements that only appear within tests. So you can give it a name of data test dash, search box or about button, and then within your test you can just search for about button and it finds it for you. I'm not going to go over that within this because it might be a bit overkill for how simple of an app this is. But if you are looking for a nice way to kind of find elements within acceptance tests or even integration tests. Definitely recommend this library. It can save you a lot of time and from writing a lot of kind of sloppy selectors. But right now we are going to write a sloppy selector, so let's do that. And it was called Jumbo. And let's save that. Element Jumbo was not found. I believe this needs to be wrapped within an and then. Okay. So the previous click that was shipping with jQuery was async by default. Our new one is not. So we will need to wrap that within an and then. If you look through the documentation for native DOM selectors, you'll see that they use the await async and await helpers. But again, you'll need to update to a later version of Babel, most likely. And you will have to be on a later version of Ember to use those. But again, I'm not going to cover that here. We're going to kind of keep going forward the way we normally would with a simple, and then. So similar to before, I'm going to pause this test and see where this contact link shows up. So it must be within here. So it's within our links, and it will be the second A tag. So now that we know it's within the links div, we can grab the nth child. We know it's the second link, so let's run our tests and see if it gets past that. Oh, whoops. Again, need to wrap this within an and then. Okay, so now we just have a couple of other failing tests. List filter, input was not found. So let's find this specific test. Should this one rental when filtering? And again, I think we're going to have to wrap this within an and then because these are not asynchronous by default. Let's move these up. And similarly here, this will need to be wrapped within an and then. Okay, so what are we missing here? Should display one listing, which is this. And it is most likely failing because, again, not asynchronous by default. So we will wrap that within an and then, make sure that any asynchronous stuff resolves. And when we save this, our test should pass. And again, we're failing now because of that same thing, where we can't use the contains selector anymore. So let's pause this test and see where that grand old mansion element is. So that would be that link there. Let's inspect this. It's within this H3 tag. It looks like we have a different test failing. This we should be able to update to this. We don't need the contains. Okay, so now we're just on this one failing test. So let's see here. I'm not selecting this right, so let's log our selector. If we find article, do we get the right element? It's null. So let's return, pause this test again, and see what I'm doing wrong. Oh, because it's a listing. Excuse me, not article. Oh, and my pause test is keeping that console log from firing. So there's listing. It doesn't look like we are clicking that correctly. And this should be text content. Okay, so it looks like we need to do it within the H3. And there we go. Okay, so that was a very roundabout way of doing it. And again, I recommend using data test selectors because it's much easier. You don't have to write verbose selectors like this. But we are at a state now where we are not using jQuery. And I forgot one more thing. Current URL actually uses jQuery as well. So we're going to import that from native DOM helpers too. And again, just making sure all of our tests pass. So that was, again, quite a journey. And it was a somewhat simple example because this app really isn't that big. We only had one example within the app where we were using jQuery other than the tests. So you might have more examples if you're using DOM selectors within your app, so just kind of be cognizant of that. But there is one more area that we have to cover where we want to remove jQuery, and that is with event dispatching. And this isn't a very obvious one. I think Ajax and DOM selectors are pretty obvious because you're probably used to writing jQuery that way. But in terms of event dispatching, it really only comes to play in one place, and that's within components. And specifically when you are binding events. So if you've watched my component video, I kind of talk over this in some detail. Components ship with this stuff for free. And I'll just show you an example here. And then I will tell it to just do what it normally does. So this super arguments, oops. And this just tells the function to continue doing what it was going to normally do. And if we come here, we are inputting. You can see that within my input. So that's one of the really cool things about components is that we can have those hooks. We can do it with submit. We can do it with key down, mouse enter. But that is done using jQuery versus something a little more verbose like DOM selectors. So this app doesn't really have many examples of that. Actually, it doesn't have any examples of binding that, but you probably have some in your apps if you're building somewhat robust apps or doing like form validation. So that's when we're going to use Robert Jackson's library, Ember native DOM event dispatcher. And this does require that you need to be on, I think, Ember 2.9 or later. So if you're watching this video, hopefully you're on the latest version of Ember. And at some point, I believe this is supposed to replace what was happening with event dispatching before. So you might not need to do this step. It might be shipping for free, but we're going to Ember install it. Ember, native DOM event dispatcher. And now we can run our app just to make sure that our tests pass. And they do still pass. So again, this app didn't have any examples of that, but it really should just be as simple as plugging it in, and should your code will look exactly the same. But again, it's not going to use jQuery for event dispatching and event listening. It's going to use the native documentation of JavaScript. So now that we've done that, we can actually go through and hopefully just remove jQuery altogether. So let's look at our package JSON here. Like I said, we don't need Ember Ajax anymore, so we can just completely delete that. Do we have jQuery within here? No. If we go to our Bower JSON, do we have jQuery within here? We do not. So where is it that we can actually get rid of jQuery? And that is within our Ember build. So you might not have ever actually edited this file before. You can certainly get away with never touching this file. I certainly have for a long time. But this is where we would do that, and we would do it using the vendor files hook. So we can control what vendor files are actually imported. So if you are using jQuery, this is where you can actually specify what version of jQuery you want to use. But here we're going to do jQuery.js null. and that's going to remove jQuery entirely from our app. So again, let's do a fresh non-bomb. We're going to completely remove our node modules and do a fresh install, and then we're going to run our app and make sure everything's still working. So once that has finished installing, let's run our app just to make sure everything's still working. In case you're wondering why am I using npm instead of yarn, it's just because this library is using npm. It doesn't have a yarn lock file. So yeah, simple as that. So let's just go through here. Looks like it's still loading. And there we go, we're not getting any errors. And let's make sure our filter works. Our filter still works. We can click on this. Cool, and it seems to be working just fine. So again, now we have an Ember app that's not using jQuery whatsoever, and certainly you've probably gotten pretty far without ever using jQuery anyway within your app. But now you don't have to kind of feel tied down to it. And just to test this, let's actually build our app just to see how big it is. So Ember build, so we'll put it into the dist folder for us, and we can actually look at the file size. So our dist folder, let's get the info on that. It's 11.6 megabytes. Again, this isn't compressed, gzipped, or anything. And let's compare that to the default Super Rentals repo. So I have that saved in original folder. And this is the same exact git sha that I pulled down. All I did was npm install, bower install, and then ember build. And we'll compare that. Get info, 12.2 megabytes. So actually pretty sizable difference. So 12.2, what was this again? 11.6, so 600 kilobytes smaller, just from removing jQuery. And we added 3 add-ons into our repo, but that's what we get for not shipping with jQuery whatsoever, is a smaller app. And you might notice a bigger size difference depending on the size of your application. So definitely something to keep in mind. Can't necessarily say it's like much more performant, but it does keep events from triggering in ways you might not expect, specifically within tests, and it can make your app read just a little bit cleaner. I personally find the jQuery syntax to kind of be kind of ugly and a little bit confusing. So hopefully you learned something from this. A couple caveats to keep in mind. The Ember inspector does actually require jQuery in some versions. I believe the latest version that's no longer the case. So if you're on an older version of that, just kind of keep that up to date. And if you're using Ember Fetch, there used to be an issue with Ember Fetch and Ember Fast Boot, where they both were overriding the same part of Ember data, the AJAX request. That's no longer the case now. I believe you'll get a warning saying that's kind of changed the namespace of Ember Fetch, and if your app has Fast Boot, so just kind of keep that in mind. You might have to write it slightly differently if you're running both of those, because they do collide in certain places, so keep that in mind. Yeah, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thanks.